My name is Fischer. I'm with the Jewish People Policy Institute. We have with us here Professor Todd Gitlin of Columbia University. And I'm going to interview Professor Gitlin about Jews in America, Jews in Israel, the American polity, and various other questions of, we hope, of great import. Okay, Professor Gitlin, we have an election coming up, and the Jewish people in America have traditionally voted Democratic. The AJC has come out with new numbers that Jewish support for the Democrats for the president has dipped below 50%, something like 47%. Are we seeing a sea change in American Jewish voting behavior and the way they see themselves on the American political map?
I doubt it. I mean, we are seeing a number of sea changes, but the attitudes toward Obama are really not of the moment because Obama's not running for office. So how Jews will vote on local, on congressional candidates is anybody's guess. There is a general, what shall I say, retrenchment, anxiety, apprehension. It's a very confused political situation. I think American Jews ought to be paying attention to the ways in which the Republican Party has become the captive of the far right, including the so-called Tea Party component, which, although its primary concern is lowering taxes, like the traditional business-minded right, it is quite accommodating to forces that have not, shall we say, always been friendly to the Jews. Maybe they're friendly to Jews in Israel because they believe that Jews in Israel have a part to play in the eschatology of the final days. I think that when some of these people are actually elected to the Senate and Congress, they will, and they ought to, frighten American Jews with their extremity, their hysteria, and their general illiberalism.
Support for Israel, according to an article published not long ago in the Weekly Standard, I think, and other places, has demonstrated that, and Stanley Greenberg spoke about it this morning, has seemed to be the province of Republicans and the right wing, and Democrats are less so. Do you think that there's a danger that Israel will lose its bipartisan support in the American electorate and in American culture?
No. First of all, I think the category support for Israel is a loose, baggy, and in some ways misleading one. It is true that Democratic, capital D, Democrat, liberal Jews are more likely to be critical of Israeli policies. They are not more likely to view the Jewish state as illegitimate. There's no difference on that score. Republicans are more absolutist in general. They're more hierarchical. They're more Manichaean. What they like big and undisputed, and what they also dislike big and undisputed. So one would expect them to have a more, what shall I say, primitive approach to matters. But on the essential question of the rationale of the Jewish state, there's no difference.
Well, you've mentioned Manichaeism and sort of hinted at theological issues underlying theological worldviews underlying surface political phenomena. You've recently written a book on divine election and how Jews and others understand divine election. Now, can we talk about that for a little while? Well, do you think there's a difference in the way that American Jews understand the divine election of the Jewish people and the way Israeli Jews understand that issue? Is that something that your book talks about?
No, not so much. Our book, and I should say it's co-authored with Liel Leibovitz, who is an Israeli, our book is concerned with America, in a sense, as a civilization, and the Jews as a civilization. So we actually don't talk that much about American Jews in particular. But what strikes us is that the foundational idea in the United States, actually before it was the United States, starting from the European settlements in the 17th century, is that what the Europeans are heading for on the other side of the ocean is God's new Israel. And this idea is very deep in American life. It's very deep in the colonial period. It's very deep even through the Revolution. Even though the revolutionaries in charge, Washington, Jefferson, and so on, many of them were deists, or in any case not attached to formal religion, the followers were, for the most part, evangelical Christians. And most American presidents have tried to come to terms, one way or the other, with the idea that America is chosen, sometimes in a more extravagant form, as in Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Reagan, principally George W. Bush, who have argued that, you know, sort of the United States is the vessel for sort of God's liberation. But even presidents we may think of as indifferent to this idea, or even hostile to it, were not untouched by it. Thomas Jefferson, for example, actually did use the phrase chosen people. He did use it in his presidency more than once. And Abraham Lincoln, who put probably the most interesting spin on the idea of chosenness, referred to Americans at one point as this almost chosen people, which we interpret as a sort of statement that chosenness is not something you inherit once and for all. It's something, the meaning of which you have to work out for yourselves. So yes, you do have a sacred task, but it is not inscribed in the tablets. So we think actually that Israelis also have not, and we're not saying they should, but Israelis, even though Zionism in its inception was very much not a religious movement, and fought quite hard not to be, and was quite suspected by religious Jews in its inception, we argue that there's a subcurrent that the idea, that the mission, the sense of the destiny that had been apportioned to the Jews, was operating even in the thoughts, sometimes even overtly, of extremely secular people like Ben-Gurion himself.
Now, so how do these deep-seated ideas, how does that affect the actual policy, behavior, and stuff like that?
Good. Yes. One thing we argue is that the powerful affinity that Americans and Israelis feel for each other actually goes back to this root.
One would think they would be in competition, wouldn't?
Well, no, because, I mean, logically one might think, you know, if you're chosen, we can't be. Right. So, but one doesn't feel it that way. One feels rather part of a common project, that is sort of, we share a devotion to the idea of divine election. So yes, technically there is a contradiction, but the logicians do not sit down to work this out. It proceeds more by feel. And we argue that, you know, this was operating in America even at the time of the recognition of the State of Israel. Harry Truman declared at one point, "I am Cyrus." Right. And there were people very, you know, General Marshall quite explicitly warned Truman not to recognize the State of Israel because it would make enemies in the Middle East and so on and so on. He was very adamant about it. And you know, in part Truman was accommodating to a Jewish friend and recognized that the Jewish population was significant. But he also, it was a matter of belief for him.
Now, many, it's been stated, you know, concerning the current administration, that kind of deep-seated, almost religious affinity is somehow missing from the current Democratic administration. That's true. Okay.
I mean, to me, Obama actually is in the tradition of Lincoln. He used an interesting phrase in his inauguration, He said in the peroration toward the end that that Americans had to choose our better history. Now, I think it's the word choose was chosen deliberately, and what it refers to is this tradition of chosenness. Let's go back to the history of the Jews. When God first comes to Abram in the story, he anoints Abram as the carrier of chosenness without stating.
We read it last week in the synagogue.
Okay. Well, then you well know that at least in the initial appearance, he doesn't specify a reason. This is quite at odds, for example, with the way in which God says to Noah, "I'm going to preserve you as opposed to all these other people because you're a righteous man." He doesn't say to Abram, "You're a righteous man." Does not give a reason. So we argue that from the very beginning, there is an uncertainty about what we're supposed to do with this, you know, and so Moses has a version of what's required, but there's an argument ensues, and this argument goes on for centuries, and then there's a sort of branch tradition that forms at a certain point that says, well, okay, in a sense, it's not so much that we're chosen, but that we must choose. That is to say, the meaning of chosenness is not something that's preordained. It's something that we have to work out. So to come back to the Americans at this point, I think that it's the case for Obama, who is a Christian, you know, by all evidence, a devout one, despite the maniacs who think that he's a secret Muslim. Although, of course, Muslims have their own version of chosenness. Right. But in any case, what Obama, I think, expresses is a sense that there's some kind of American destiny that has to be worked out that is not simply particularistic. It's not simply something we do over here on our continent, but which is not to say it needs to be carried forth the way Bush did. To the contrary, but that it's foolish to think of the United States as a normal nation.